Hi, everyone. Welcome to Food Talk Live. I'm your host, Danny Nierenberg. Today, we have a really special discussion around the film A Reckoning in Boston, which explores systemic racism in the food system and the challenges farmers and activists and communities face. I'm really honored to have with us Kafi Dixon. She is an activist, mother, and the founder and lead organizer of the Common Good Cooperative, Boston's first urban farming co-op, working to create environments of health for lower resourced women of color and working class families in New England. She is also one of the producers of the Reckoning in Boston film. And we have with us James Rutenbeck, who is a nonfiction film editor and the director and founder of Lost Nation Pictures, a nonfiction film company based in Boston. James is also the director, writer, and editor of A Reckoning in Boston. We're also waiting for another special guest, Ben Burkett, who will hopefully join us in a few minutes. So, Kafi and James, I want to start with you both. If you could, sort of describe what this film is about and why it needed to be made.
Kafi, do you want to start, or do you want? Okay. It started 6 years ago when I was interested in a free humanities course for low-income people in Dorchester, Mass. It's called the Clemente Course in the Humanities, and it's a free night class in art, history, literature, and philosophy that meets 2 nights a week. It's tuition-free, and the students who get through one academic year, which is what the course is, get 6 credits at Bard College. I had heard a speaker. I went to a benefit dinner and heard a graduate speak, and she was this charismatic woman who had really turned her life around through her engagement with the Clemente course. And I thought that could be like a really interesting film idea, and a sort of a cinematic interpretation of that experience could be really quite interesting. And so it's a low budget film that we filmed over 6 years with grants that came in sort of piecemeal over time.
Mm-hmm.
But at the start, I had just enough money to bring a crew into Dorchester and film 7 or 8 classes of the Clemente course. And then I assumed, and this has been sort of the way I've worked in the past, that as I collected more material and edited it, I could raise more money to keep the film going. I knew I always wanted a larger context, not just the course, and I wanted to portray the lives of the characters in the film.
Mm-hmm.
But I didn't realize how complicated that would become, and that's part of the story of the film.
Wow. Kafi, I think you're on mute, so if I wondered if you can also weigh in and talk about the film and what its message is.
I ended up in the class, A Reckoning in Boston. The documentary follows the story of myself and Carl Chandler, and goes from a context of being about education within a community in the humanities, and directly comes up against how we exist in these communities. The first title for the documentary was, what was it, James? It was,
well, we've had like 4 titles, but
the one that
resonated for you and Carl was Invisible.
Yeah. Because we were dealing with these experiences where we were existing in a community where the oppression and the marginalization literally made people feel invisible.
Sure.
And that was a powerful way to look at this, these 2 cities that exist in Boston, and to talk about how 2 cities can exist in such a heavily resourced city.
Yeah, that's such an interesting, I went to graduate school in Boston, so I saw some of that kind of firsthand, but that is truly, it is 2 cities in one. And coming, I grew up in a town near St. Louis. That city is also 2 cities in one. There's a very, line across the city between black and white. And I think that feeling invisible must be such an obstacle for so many folks. And I'm wondering how you work to overcome that obstacle and be seen by by your own community and other communities, and what that's like?
Oddly enough, thankfully, I have a bit of a muscle towards an introvert. Still now, I spend a lot of time behind the scenes doing my work. But to be invisible in the city there's a lack of realization around the oppressive weight of being, again, not seen, marginalized based on your race, your class, your culture in the city. So you stop realizing that you don't have the experiences of the wealthier and the privileged, right?
Sure.
You stop realizing that you're impoverished. You stop realizing that you're existing in deficits. You stop realizing of the lack of community equity you have, the lack of health equity you have, and you just literally go on existing. But one of the things that was interesting to me in my philosophy course through the humanities was what is it to live and what is it to flourish. And so while I was there in the class being educated on basic things, right, feeling that that would help me be visible to the people that I was talking to about this project for cooperative for African American women as a community stabilizing initiative. I was also learning about Antigone's dilemma. I was
Mm.
about what is the Latin definition of flourishing, right? I was learning about the city, the community, governance. So I was taking that and I was realizing that my experiences weren't individualized, and
Mm.
I was bringing it back to the women. Um, my hopes for us and a belief in our ability to direct our own lives, right? And to change our experiences here in Boston.
You said something really important, about this oppressive weight and the lack of equity in a lot of aspects of folks' lives. And it's not just enough to live. You want to flourish. You don't want to just survive. You want to thrive. And I think this is something that's important for folks to realize. I'm wondering for you both, how, this was filmed over 6 years. You must have changed directions quite a bit, or changed your minds about things. And for you, James, I'm sure you changed your perspective as you were interacting with the community. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I mean, I came to realize that I live just 8 miles from where Kafi lives, just west, right, in a suburb west of Boston. And there was a lot that, as I spent time with Kafi, and she sort of over time became a guide, sort of a cultural guide for me to this parallel society that these societies we were living side by side in, but separately, right? And I think that it took a while for me to sort of process all that, because a lot of the things that I saw, like in the chaos in housing court, which is in Boston once a week, and where, dozens of poor people basically show up, many without legal support, to try to like maintain some housing security, right? But mostly fail at that. And then I went to housing subsidy agencies with Kafi. I think basically I had a guide who was actually very generous and patient with me, who helped me start to look beneath the surface of the city of Boston. I mean, it's a city that I love Boston. I've always loved it here, but I didn't really understand it completely.
And the interesting thing about that experience for James, and a lot of women of color questioned, like, why are you letting this white man in? I mean,
of course.
We're sharing because James just told me the other day on another call that, we were essentially identified as like these troublemakers and problematic Black women, and advocacy for ourselves. So sharing, James, a lot of the women in the co-op were like looking like, who is this white dude? Like, and he's pulling out a camera. But I wanted James to come into my world because not a strong Black woman in the archetype of a strong Black woman, a strong Black woman in the face of competency, in the face of being integrated into my community, in the face of feeling like I have an education, in the face of, you know, having businesses, being an entrepreneur from the age of 19, regardless of not having a high school education or college education, regardless of always dealing with destabilized housing, regardless of dealing with the aggression of social services. And I was
Sure.
to a point in my life, and it was kismet, where James was asking me to film while I was pulling myself out of the last throes of that existence as a younger woman or as a middle-aged woman in Boston. And I wanted someone, before I pulled out of that life and went to Vermont, you know, purchased my land and, you know, opened a business, I wanted to offer the James an opportunity to come into our community and to see the aggression and the violent spaces that we as Black women, not just here, Black women and men, not just here in Boston, but around the country.
Right.
We in a certain socioeconomic class exist in spaces of violence and aggression and are in complacency, right? And oppression. And that if nobody else was willing to allow this man with a camera to witness, then in my due diligence and my need for people to know who I was, to know the work I did, and to know my community, that I would make myself open, available, and vulnerable to James around, again, how my community is perceived and the pushback that we were dealing with around this project.
I looked at what Kafi was trying to do with these other women, and to me it seemed admirable and innovative. It's like a grassroots effort coming from a community to feed people in a community and raise food. And yet the shocking thing for me, and the thing that it took me so long to understand, was why it was so difficult for something so sort of noble and idealistic to get off the ground. Like, why was everyone putting up obstacles? And that was the thing that, you know, I had to process and understand.
I had to bring James in and say, you need to understand how we're denied equity. You need to understand the fear of women of color being solution-based within their community, or wanting more of a presence in how the direction of their community.
Of course. Can we take a step back, Kafi, and can you tell us about the cooperative and what it really, what it looks like? Paint a picture for our viewers and listeners, if you can.
Yeah, I always, the joke in the statement is, this is really not about agriculture. This is really not about farming. The cooperative, once I realized that, you know, I was coming out of being bamboozled, for the lack of a better word, in closing my organic produce shop. There's a WNPR interview where I'm just opening up my shop and talking about the process of opening the first organic produce shop in Dorchester, and a Main Streets Association convincing me to close down for a better opportunity, and then denying me that opportunity, right? So that was so interesting to me. So I realized, and then I come with the food buying group. And you asked a question like how we may have changed, and or how this has evolved. My intention in the project and the model has always been consistent. The only thing that makes this model look convoluted was the lack of support around from a city, from foundations, from organizations here in Boston. So one of the things that was like really apparent to me is that we literally had to help ourselves, and that I needed to bring women together, to bring them back to the day and age of as the elders and the sharecroppers and Ben Burkett and Barbara James and Shirley Sherrod had taught me in these very intimate conversations the power of the African American initiated co-op, right? And the design of it. So I was saying to the women, lift up a Black woman, you lift up an entire community. And although I had been able to lift myself up, I looked back to the women to offer my support and my reinvestment in them to assist them and again, lifting each other up, right? I self-invested in the farm. I self-invested in purchasing a 2-family cooperative house for them. I quit my job to do this co-op. And it was all under the premise of teaching African American communities, especially women, me personally reinvesting in them to teach them about what cooperative equity is and what collective works look like, and how that can be a stabilizing, how that could be a stabilizing exercise within itself. Other women of color, and to say it does not have to be about the violence of existing in the nonprofit world in Boston. It does not have to be about the violence of existing as a Black woman in a startup community in Boston, not having any support about that, but that I was not going to leave Boston as I had planned, but I was going to stay here and reinvest my time and energy and teaching them about something that was familiar to me already, which was cooperative works. So to talk about the Common Good Cooperative, it essentially is a social co-op. And it's a social co-op that's based in community health. And that was always our messaging around engaging in the city, engaging with foundations, engaging with stakeholders, was to receive this co-op, right? Not to make it disappear or hopes it disappears, not to oppress it to the point of non-existence, but to allow us the resources to form and to stabilize ourselves as we knew we could do. And as thinking about my patron saint, Fannie Lou Hamer, and now Stacey Abrams and Michelle Obama, we've always had the power to uplift our community. It's just in the darkness of our skin sometimes. Again, we're challenged to have our voices heard or to exercise our power. So the co-op is merely me as a co-op developer, as a farmer, as an agriculturalist, as an environmentalist, as a policy hawk, right? Saying to the women, you have the power to save yourselves. And because of that mindset, during COVID-19, our farm, which nobody wanted to happen, was able to serve families in our community over 600 pounds of produce. Myself,
amazing,
built 42 beds, 42 raised beds.
Wow.
Planted everything from eggplant to tomatoes and okra. And through the CDC guidance, we're able to provide 600 pounds of produce that was grown, 450 pounds of it, which was grown by myself and myself alone.
Wow.
Urban farm during the time of COVID.
That's amazing.
In your homes.
That's amazing. Yeah. You said something before that, if you lift up women, you lift up a community. And you've both been described, in sort of, or described yourselves as troublemakers. And what boggles my mind is we're talking about a cooperative that's based in community health and based on lifting people up. How are you perceived as troublemakers? It boggles me. And I know it was different for you, Kafi, when the cameras were there and James was there. And I wonder if you can both talk about, how you were, treated differently when those cameras were on.
I'll let James take this because I was laser focused on advocacy, right? And some of the things I want to talk about the documentary, and when you see the women in the room, the women were in the room because I made space for them. A lot of times women didn't even know why they were in the room, had no idea who they were talking to. And this is not me saying that they were not capable of knowing, but I was saying, I'm making space in a room for you to be in this conversation. And this is what we're talking about. So, but James was on the other side and he had a completely different experience with why we were considered troublemakers.
Right. Well, I just wanted to make an observational film about basically, the kind of films that I make are like the most exciting thing about nonfiction filmmaking for me is that you're sort of following something that's unfolding. And I knew when I met Kafi early on that she had very high aspirations for herself and dreams. And I could tell she had a lot of grit and determination, and she was charismatic and interesting. And so I thought, this is a risk. It's always a risk, but this is like a pretty safe risk in some ways, because I knew that she would do something great at a certain point. What happened was that in sort of doing this silent witnessing thing that filmmakers often do, and that I had done, somehow we hit a nerve with the city of Boston. And so we filmed a couple of meetings with the city, but then our access was cut off at a certain point. And there were public meetings that Kafi was part of, like in her neighborhood, where she was sharing her plans to try to enlist the support of her neighbors that we were banned from, which is like crazy. And so I realized that what Kafi was doing was, for some reason, or what we were sort of recording was something that the city or someone in the city came to see as threatening in some way to them.
Yeah.
And that's when I became like, oh, I'm this rebel filmmaker. Like I started out being just, this fly on the wall guy in a corner, and I became this political filmmaker, which is something I've come to live with and I'm really happy about.
Sure.
But it was not, and it was that turn that sort of changed the film and the trajectory of the film and the storytelling as well.
Well, it's so, I didn't see, to be honest with you, I had gotten to the point of just being so frustrated and saddened by some of the blatant racial marginalization that we were experiencing that I didn't care. And I realized that, and I spent a lot of the reason that I asked James to bring his voice and his perspective into the film of witnessing these really aggressive situations, right? Is that I wanted him to understand that there was no reason for this level of dehumanization around this project.
Sure.
That what we were doing, I wanted him to understand that what we were doing was changing a system. The Common Good Project, the Common Good cooperative as a whole is a system changer. It's innovation in its purest form by a community we all profess to want to see be innovative, right? And see themselves differently. But I realized, and I was trying to explain to James, because it wasn't only that the city, I mean, in the documentary, you'll witness the city was pushing back, but it was large institutions that were pushing back on women actually resolving the problems,
their own problems. Yeah.
And it was witnessing the violence in the 501c3 space to Black women.
Absolutely.
That is how they work in the organizations, or their lack of integration into organization and funding. But it was witnessing the violence of Black women asking for seed funding for resolution-based organization. And this coming off of a time when a think tank was revisioning food systems for the state of Massachusetts and put out a 63 report and failed to mention integrating women of color, especially generational African Americans, as a culture to white America into farming, agriculture, and food systems, or even business ownership as economic solidarity and sustainability for these communities that are being moved out.
Absolutely. And this dehumanization that you've talked about, and how for some reason it's scary for white folks to watch Black folks organize and work to solve their own problems. that's a real problem, as you mentioned, in the nonprofit world. And I'm wondering, so much has changed, obviously, over the last 13 months. We had not only had the pandemic, we've had the terrible murders of people like Breonna Taylor and George Floyd and countless others. Do you think the foundation, world is waking up to sort of what they've done in the past and what needs to be done now?
I hope through this documentary and through my work, I really do hope. Everybody asks, what do you want your outcome to be in this? And I say, people not only need to learn from our successes, from my successes, but they also should learn from my failures, right?
Yeah.
There should be more resolution-based funding. We were able to do this with piecemeal funding and me purchasing a home for the women, where there's organizations that exist with $1 million budgets. And there was a time that I went into debt and bankruptcy to keep this project going. And like the sobbing of a grown woman on the couch, like, oh my God, I can't believe I'm gonna lose my house and looking to provide liberation, right? There needs to be a new system because the world is changing and the wealth gap and economic gaps are even more pronounced than before. So how are we doing things differently? And I think, as again, Professor Dr. Ona would say, we need to interrogate ourselves around homogenous spaces that are exclusionary. We need to interrogate ourselves about violent spaces. We need to interrogate ourselves around the pushback of isms, of colorism, of racism, of classism. And it's only then when we push back and interrogate ourselves and how we are complicit and contribute to supremacy, colonization, marginalization, do projects and initiatives and perspectives from people like me rise to the top as a way to provide dignity within communities rather than solely charity.
Absolutely. That paradigm really needs to change around dignity. Thank you so much for saying that. There's a line in the film's trailer where you say, "Justice is not what you do. Justice is who we are." And can you talk maybe both of you about how the film, portrays this? You talked about it a little bit already, but it's such a great line, Kafi, and I just think it needs to be said again and again.
I think that what I really love James's perspective because I really do hold James as a dear friend and close to my heart, because he's never been someone that's like said, oh, I've taken a racial justice training class and I get it now. Like, I can come into your community. I'm culturally competent. I can do this work. James has always said, I don't understand this, but I want to. I want to witness it. I want to be thoughtful about it. I've received texts from James in the middle of the night talking about something that we saw or that we said, or him reflecting on a poem that aligned with a conversation or a meeting that we were in. So I think that James Moore may be positioned to talk about, through the perspective of a white man, right, what justice or the importance of justice within communities.
Right. Well, yeah, I mean, I think what I came to understand, I think a lot of white people think, well, I'm nice to Black people, so I'm not racist. But what I came to understand is, like, we're all participating in a system. We're all complicit in this system. And but if we don't really understand our place in it, then we can never sort of get to a point beyond a very shallow understanding.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't expect a Black person to Black people to educate white people about these things. I just happened to have this opportunity with someone who was two people and actually more people. Like, there are other people, Tolga, Kafi's friend Tolga, who's in the film,
Kim Houston,
Kafi, Carl, and other friends who were never on screen, but who worked with me on bringing my voice into the film. We actually had a working group. I had a working group of Black people around me who were helping me figure out how my voice should come into the film. And encouraging me to do that, and to saying to me in a way that my voice matters, which is like so ironic, because I started out this whole thing wanting to give a voice to people like Kafi, right? And then the whole table was turned in the end, and they were like, she and others were giving a voice to
at
me.
the table for James.
Yeah.
And one of the things that we predominantly work with interns of color from HBCUs, we bring them up to Boston. We let them see what a heavily resourced looks like, and then where the deficits exist, right? And so a lot of times you'll be having a Tuskegee student who's big animal science talking to someone who's running another project and talking down to her, and literally not knowing that this young girl, Ashley or Tracy, has more education in that science than them. So in bringing James in and talking about these spaces, yeah, we did need to turn the tables, because what I was saying the whole time and talking about the women, give me the resources to put back in my community. We're not asking for you to come in and to do anything. What we do ask you for is the space and the autonomy and resources that we request to build this out. And that just seemed like to be so huge for people who are grappling with shame and guilt. And another conversation, just to put a pin in this, that we always have with the women, where that I don't inherently feel like all white people are bad, just like I don't inherently feel like all Black people are good, right? I understand that we all have our own struggles and challenges, but when I talk about humanizing the work and allowing Black women to uplift themselves, allowing me and the co-op to uplift each other, I'm talking about give us the space and the autonomy and the dignity to pull from our ways as Black women, these magical ways where we can make changes. But if you're constantly marginalizing us again and questioning our competency or picking one and not the other, then you don't allow us that space, and we are stagnated. And the resilience that you speak about wanting to see in communities is hollow, because this resilience with your help or your heroicism is not resilience based off of Black people understanding that they can do this.
Right. And I've heard from folks like Karen Washington and the Bronx time and time again, it's not, charity, as you said before, Kafi, that communities need. What they need is capital. And I, they need that investment. And that's what's been lacking for so long. And I hope that's what, foundations are thinking about very deeply right now, is that infrastructure that you need to build a cooperative that, is already successful, but how can you scale that success out in different ways and help others learn from it and replicate it?
And we would love to be, I'm waiting for any of the foundations within the city of Boston. We received more support from outside of the city than we did from within, which was, as James was witnessing, powerful. But yeah, it was always about needing capital. Self-funding was me putting my own capital back into the faith of the co-op and the women. There were a lot of people that I turned down because who were in the cooperative world, who weren't allowing us to have our own autonomy and were trying to fund us as a nonprofit rather than provide us the capital to have true equity, right?
Business, yeah.
Or to let us use a fiscal sponsor, because that fiscal sponsor was the importance of capital and true equity. So the 5 years that we took to get to this point where we became a resolution for COVID-19 and health disparities was based on trying to develop relationships where foundations they're not ready to pivot, right, into economic development as a true form of sustainability.
Right. That's such a powerful point. And again, I know a lot of foundations that I personally know, or who I personally know, are thinking deeply about this, but I don't know if it's deeply enough. And that's what I fear, and there's so many things that I hope change post-COVID, that we don't go back to the way things were. And that's really one of them, that foundations take a different view of the nonprofit world, for sure.
Yeah, because we definitely are recreating, again, racist and misogynistic
Well,
institutions.
yeah,
Like,
yeah,
we are
absolutely,
not to bring
absolutely.
the power back to the people.
I love it. That's great. I'm so sorry that our other guest, Ben Burkett, who's, such a great farmer, speaker, world traveler, and a real advocate for Black farmers in the South. And,
Yeah.
he's been so great at building cooperatives and teaching folks how to do it. I know you met him and were able to become friends, and he's on speed dial on your phone. As we sort of wrap up the conversation, can you talk about what that relationship with Ben Burkett really means to you?
Oh man, yeah. In my quest to not for my I'm still a social impact entrepreneur. So my long-term vision for the co-op is to turn over the projects and to go back into another project around social entrepreneurship for a community of women of color. But in the challenges that I was experiencing with this, I was dumbfounded and really hurt, right? And it was challenging my mental health at some point.
Sure.
Challenge my financial health, but for my mental health. And as we were sharing earlier, I just woke up one morning and found Ben and flew down to see him. And we had this conversation about the importance of Black people. One, violence. Two, African American cooperative developers, the history of it in Petal, Mississippi, in Hattiesburg, Mississippi. Essentially, he let me know that I wasn't alone. And I was traveling in the footsteps of a Fannie Lou Hamer, of Ben's mother, of his family, right? Of trying to create, cultivate, and sustain safe space and a violent context, right?
Sure.
In those relationships, again, in those conversations and that mentorship, has I haven't been able to find it anywhere else. So the power that he brings to African American generational maternal paternal African American families, maternal paternal African American farmers, landowners, business developers, that mentorship is invaluable. And that makes Ben himself and people like Barbara James and Shirley Sherrod invaluable as well. And will bring
Absolutely.
so much weight. And I'm thankful for him.
That's wonderful. He is such a powerhouse, and he's a very kind person. We were talking about before how he's spoken at food tank events. He's one of the kindest, smartest people I've ever met. So I'm glad that you have him on your side. I want to ask you both as we wrap up, Kafi, how can people support the co-op?
Well, what we're hoping first with Food Tank, Danny, is that we're doing our membership drive is coming up soon. I want to thank Dr. Ona and Nicole Morris of Tufts University and Dorcas and so many other academics of color, tenured professors for supporting us around this. But we'll be doing our membership drive soon. And if you go to our website, commongoodcooperatives.com, you can collect and link to our meetup, which is a co-op for women of color. All are welcome to join. Right now, we have 927 members,
Wow.
women of color, on that co-op. And that's always been the high number since we were starting. So that was always a head scratcher. Like, you see 900 women, what is the pushback on supporting us with capital? But we do accept donations. We are providing people membership with the donations. We also need resources. So if there are any thoughtful, culturally competent, even if you're not culturally competent, co-op developers, we would love resources. We live for in-kind donations, and we practice extreme reciprocity. So the clear ask is to go to the website. If you have money to donate. It will go into our 2021 growing season that's coming up in March, April. And also it goes back into the co-op and allows memberships. And also if there are any resources that you have around cooperative development, business development, structuring legal services, we are still in line for them because there is a determination to make sure that this co-op 20 years from now, you can come back and it's still sustainable, it's still equity-based,
Absolutely.
focused on women of color.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
That's great. So, James, I know you're trying to finish up this film.
Yeah.
Where can people support it?
So the film will be airing on PBS on Independent Lens in next year, probably. Meanwhile, we have an engagement campaign, and we're encouraging people to follow us on social media, on Facebook and Twitter. And at our website, areckoninginboston.com, you can sign up if you'd like to participate with us in having conversations about racial justice, affordable housing, cooperative agriculture, many of the issues that are in the film. And in fact, if you are part of any organization that cares about those issues and would like to partner with us, we would urge you to get in touch with us, because we want the film to be seen widely in communities, and we want it to we want conversations about these issues all over the U.S.
We need conversation. And I want to thank you, Danny, and I want to thank Food Tank for hosting this conversation. It's so important. And to ask people to come out of guilt and shame around, especially at a time where we're watching our politics and our society boil down and become extremely tribal, to come out of guilt, shame, fear, and to challenge us to work together, right? And to work together thoughtfully.
That's a great way to end. Thank you both so much. It's been so wonderful to talk to you both. I hope you stay safe and well. And a reminder that this live stream will also be on our podcast, Food Talk with Danny Nierberg. Thank you both again.
Thank you
so much, Danny. It's been a pleasure.
Have a good